Great. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you to everybody again for registering, for promoting, for putting the word out there. We're really excited about this evening because it's going to be a new mashup between community and city leaders and experts. But before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Um, Oh, well, I'm going to have to say the land acknowledgement from my heart. I want to thank the ancestors and the creators for all they have done for bringing nature into our world and for inspiring us and healing us from the environmental pollutants that are out there. We also want to acknowledge that this land is unceded territory of the Native Americans that are original from this land, who also happen to be my ancestors. And I want to make sure that we have nothing but healing blessings for this land. Thank you so much. Again, big thank you to our community leaders who have taken time to promote, and you're an integral part of this event. So extreme heat is going to be a bigger part of our lives. And as Angelinos, for the foreseeable future, we need to learn how to manage it and design and build a better world to make sure that its impact is not disproportionately felt by the historically disinvested communities. At CEMO, we recognize that extreme heat poses a disproportionate threat to low-income communities and communities of color. That's why we will launch the Heat Relief for LA campaign this May that is aimed at providing resources and support to those most vulnerable to the dangers of extreme heat. So stay tuned for May 24th, 2023. Our office is working also very hard to promote climate equity by providing access to cooling resources like cooling centers, shade structures, resilience hubs, open space, permeable pavement, more tree canopy, shade equity, hydration stations in areas where access to these resources is limited. And this summer, we are also partnering with community organizations and frontline leaders to educate and engage communities that experience these risks at a higher level. So true equity means more than just providing temporary relief during these summer heat waves. That's why we're also working to address the root causes of these inequalities, like a lack of affordable housing and insufficient access to healthcare. Our work is about reshaping the city of LA to be livable for all under climate change and extreme heat. The city exists. Yes, it exists to create healthy, thriving, connected communities, and our work is making it so people can stay safe, healthy, and comfortable and cool. Extreme heat affects all of us, and with our whole city working together, we can protect our most vulnerable. Who do we mean by that? Our neighboring communities, who because of excess pollution burden, history of redlining, and disinvestment, are more vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat because they lack open space, they lack trees, they lack shade, and those communities were just not designed for walking or mobility. Our youth, who should be able to play and study while breathing easy and cooling down at night. Our elders, our family members and neighbors with health conditions, who should be able to continue to thrive even as the future is different from the past. People with chronic illnesses and disabilities, and let's not forget that heat also causes mental health breakdowns and increases in violence. And this is an important thing to remember during heat season for those who are in public safety positions. So it's more than just temperature. These historically disinvested communities also have higher levels of air pollution, lower levels of tree cover, and quite often other shortfalls in the quality of available housing and healthcare. And we believe our city government is uniquely capable of this work because our departments touch Angelinos' lives directly. All of us are getting energy from our Department of Water and Power. Everyone drives or walks on the streets maintained by Public Works. For example, our crosswalks, our buses, our bus shelters, our parks, and our libraries are all part of our future relief heat strategies. So a chief heat officer's role then is to coordinate the work of these departments into a unified, effective climate and heat plan. And those departments are just as excited to be on board as I am to work with them and with you. So I want to thank them all. So this is what climate action looks like at the local level. To work to save our planet includes protecting people who will suffer the most in extreme heat, And we need to start today, building the resilient city of tomorrow. We can now have a cooler future if we work to beat the heat with heat resilient zones. More on that at our future launch in May. I think I'll end there just because we're running a little bit behind time, if that makes sense. And now I'd like to transition over to our next speakers, Andres? To Agustin Cabrera and Ana Karen from, you know what, Andres, I'm gonna, a little blooper here. I did not bring their bios with me. So if you could step in, Andres, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So today we'll be having Ana Karen Ramirez, Policy Director from Pacoima Beautiful. Ana Karen grew up in Northeast San Fernando Valley, ancestral Tataviam territory, where she learned about the unjust zoning policies and practices that shaped her community. This mobilized her to work towards equitable and community-driven solutions in communities impacted by environmental racism. At Pacoima Beautiful, she focuses on intentionally creating opportunities for community to inform decisions on the following policy areas: clean energy, transportation, zero waste, digital equity, public health, and land use. You can find her rock climbing, gardening, practicing poetry, or practicing pottery, or planning new adventures in her spare time. And Agustin Cabrera will also be joining as Policy Director of Scope. Agustin Cabrera has nearly a decade of experience developing strategic campaigns and leadership development programs that center workers, clean energy, and equity. Cabrera is the Policy Director for Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education, also known as SCOPE, Los Angeles, a grassroots organization focused on climate and economic justice in South LA. Before joining SCOPE, Cabrera was the lead organizer at Services Employees International Union, United Healthcare Workers West, where they spent over 3 years organizing social, economically diverse groups of hospital workers across California. They are passionate about climate justice, workers' rights, and queer trans visibility. And it is with an incredible pleasure that I have the honor of introducing these two wonderful organizers and leaders, Agustin and Ana Karen. All you.
Hi, thank you, Andres. Again, thank you all for joining us today for this very incredible dialogue with community, with local stakeholders. So I'm gonna start us off and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ana Karen. As Andres said, I'm Agustin Cabrera. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Policy Director at Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education. We're a grassroots base building organization in South Central on Florence and Western, so come check us out. We're also a proud member of LEAP LA. And before I share more about last year's workshops, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about LEAP LA and who we are and what our values are. We're located on unceded Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash lands. LEAP LA aims to create spaces to practice healing, remediation, and community resilience. We recognize that BIPOC, economically exploited, and frontline communities bear the burden of the existing settler colonial, extractive, and toxic economy. Our coalition is made up of intergenerational, multiracial, and intersectional community-based organizations. We organize to uphold principles of tribal sovereignty and community self-determination in order to influence systemic change, governance structures, and achieve climate justice. And so the organizations that compose LEAP LA are SCOPE, Pacoima Beautiful, Communities for a Better Environment, Esperanza Community Housing, Sacred Places Institute, and Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. And we were some of the key advocates and architects for designing these workshops and the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. So thank you for kind of allowing me to give a brief overview of who we are. But I'm going to dive into some of brief reflections on last year's takeaways. I hope that you all also joined us last year in our dialogue and conversation. And so what we learned from hundreds of community members, from grass top advocates and stakeholders, are one, that we really need to engage community residents to design resiliency strategies, right? Policy solutions should start and be driven by those that are impacted first and worst by the climate crisis. And so that was one of the key takeaways from last year's workshops. Secondly, we want to develop specific localized strategies to protect populations at risk from wildfires, flooding, and/or extreme heat. We need to invest in multi-benefit solutions that advance equity, and we need to address the root causes of climate change. And so luckily, we were able to put these reflections into action, and many of these takeaways and the series itself inform the city's equitable building decarbonization policies and how that process is a model for policy co-design with frontline communities. So we're already putting the work of these workshops into action. They're actually informing city policies. So we're really excited to, again, be having these dialogues in the second year of the Climate Equity LA series. And we look forward to hearing from you and the communities that you represent. So lastly, I want to share our original vision for this process, which will hopefully serve as a guiding principle in the next coming workshop. So we want to make sure that the City of LA, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, listens, engages, and empowers frontline community members in LA towards climate justice and a just transition that will foster collective decision-making on how we equitably address climate change. We need to ensure capacity building of frontline leaders like yourselves, many of those that are in this room, to properly equip them for community participatory climate decision-making. And we want to make sure that these dialogues provide critical feedback to the City of LA for the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, design, and its accompanying implementation plans. And then lastly, we want to advocate for more community assemblies in person to be held in frontline communities like South LA, Pacoima, and the Harbor. So that's it for sort of last year's reflections, and looking forward to the wonderful discussions that we have upcoming this year. So I'll hand it off to my colleague, Anna Karen.
Thank you, Agustin. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for including me in such an important dialogue this evening. For folks that may not be familiar with Pacoima Beautiful, we're also a grassroots environmental justice nonprofit serving Pacoima and surrounding communities in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. And our community organizing efforts and projects are centered at the intersection of building community power to address the root causes of climate change, as well as implementing community-led projects at various scales to ensure that especially our most vulnerable communities are prepared for the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing today. As important as education is around the various mitigation strategies that we as a community need to embrace and advocate for, a key component to our work is building community leadership, as well as providing direct services. And the myriad of services and programming that we provide, as well as other strong relationships with service-based organizations, is really building strong relationships, as well as becoming a trusted source of resources and information in the community, which we saw, especially last year in the CELA series, that is essential to emergency preparedness. Last year, we heard that social cohesion is the foundation for community resilience, especially in historically segregated and redline communities such as our own. From the vaccine clinics that we host to our rate assistant programs, youth development, as well as our community inspectors program, we're building up not only community leadership, but the trust and relationships that are necessary to effective climate resilience programs. And we take this same approach that we pilot and implement by offering several programs that prioritize multi-benefit projects, again, in our historically redline communities. An example of this would be our Transformative Climate Communities grant that brought 2,000 trees to Pacoima and Sun Valley to combat the urban island heat effect, as well as planning for an electric bus fleet that will offset the high rates of air pollution, as well as other respiratory illnesses that we face due to the all-encompassing truck routes and freeways that surround our communities. And another example of this would be our Bradley Plaza and Green Alley project that was made possible through partnerships with LA Sanitation and Trust for Public Land and other donors by improving existing spaces where community members are already congregating and adding much needed shade infrastructure, as well as spaces to capture stormwater as well. So we have a lot of native landscaping in the area, but something that is really important is the connectivity that this also provides to our community center, which houses our outdoor equity program, our electric car share program, and our electric bike share program as well. And so being able to really amplify all of the services and programming that are existing already in the space, making it so that this space is also going to be improved in the next year with the infrastructure necessary to store and capture renewable energy is now in the early steps as well of identifying other services and improvements that are necessary to further meet the needs of residents at the San Fernando Gardens. And so this is just one example of the way that, you know, us as another organization working in a corner of LA that often gets forgotten, but yet still faces a lot of those compounding effects of environmental racism. We're really trying to center and focus a lot of the resources, especially in areas that are facing a lot of, that often get forgotten, especially with renters and multi-unit homes. And so again, we're trying to model things in a smaller scale to really bring forth what Agustin mentioned in terms of how can we also make sure that these projects are being replicated in other areas of LA, and that we have that funding as well, and those connections with folks at the city level and the department as well to move some of these projects forward. So I hope that's helpful in just giving some examples of what we're doing in the Valley. And I'm looking forward to learning from other folks today as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ana Karen and Agustin. Always a pleasure. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce one incredible speaker in conversation as well with an organizer. I'll be introducing community leader and phone banker for Communities for a Better Environment, Maria Montes. Maria migrated to the US in 1988 and lived in Wilmington. Currently, she lives in San Pedro, and her sisters and granddaughters live in Wilmington and Harbor City on both sides of the refinery. Members of her family have asthma and eczema. When she joined CBE, she understood that refineries, oil drilling, and local heavy industry played a role on the health impacts faced by her family. Maria was encouraged by her sister to attend her first CBE meeting in 2001. She has become a core leader in the organization and has participated in multiple projects. For the past 2 years, she has been a phone banker with the Stay Housed LA program, where she connects low-income tenants with legal resources. She has participated in multiple local and statewide endorsement processes with Communities for Better Environment Action Team, the C4 sister organization to CBE. She participates in the Resilience Squad, where she continues to increase access to resilience hubs and climate adaptation in Wilmington. Additionally, she has been a promotora de salud with LA Care for over 15 years. And today we have the privilege of her joining us in conversation with her fellow colleague, organizer, and the care coordinator of Communities for a Better Environment, Laura Gracia. And with that, Maria and Laura, I shall pass it off to you. Before I do, again, please, this conversation will be in Spanish. So if you are an English monolingual speaker, if you only speak English, I remind you again to please select the appropriate interpretation under the English channel. Thank you. Laura y María, un placer.
Hola a todos, todas, todes. A todos, gracias por estar aquí. Yo soy Laura, solo estoy aquí para apoyar a María, darles unas preguntas para que podamos tener una conversación. Nosotros somos CBE, estamos con, disculpe, Comunidades para un Mejor Medio Ambiente. CBE es una organización estatal. Nosotros trabajamos aquí en Wilmington, en las ciudades de sureste de Los Ángeles y en Richmond y en East Oakland. Nosotros trabajamos con jóvenes y adultos y ahorita María está aquí con nosotros para hablar un poco de su experiencia. So, para empezar, díganos, ¿quién es María?
Buenas tardes, gracias por la oportunidad que están aquí con ustedes. Pues yo soy María, soy promotora de salud. He estado, como dicen, en mi comunidad por muchos años. Soy miembro de CBE y ahorita también soy telefonista con Stay Home LA.
¿Y cómo es que usted empezó a trabajar en proyectos y temas de resiliencia?
Bueno, como les digo, he estado como en mi comunidad. Una hermana un día me invitó y me dijo, ven, vamos a oír una plática de mejoramiento de ambiente. Entonces yo le dije, ¿qué es eso? Bueno, vamos a ver qué es, ¿verdad? Y me gustó mucho porque vimos ahí qué es lo que hacen, cómo la refinería. Yo no sabía lo que era mi comunidad, entonces ahí aprendí bastante y he seguido participando y pues gracias porque ya soy miembro activo.
Díganos un poco de las encuestas que usted hizo en el proyecto del año pasado.
Sí, como les digo, soy miembro de ustedes, entonces me invitaron a hacer unas encuestas que dijeron que es sobre resiliencia. Yo dije, ¿qué resiliencia? Yo la verdad no sabía qué era. Entonces ya me dijeron, mira, resiliencia es un lugar donde la gente puede acudir en cualquier caso de una emergencia. Entonces, empezamos a hacer encuestas y mi sorpresa fue también esa, que no estamos preparados, que mucha gente no sabe lo que es y que tenemos que estar apoyándonos para saber y darnos a conocer.
Ella mencionó un centro de resiliencia y ¿puede explicar qué significa eso?
Pues básicamente es un lugar donde tú puedes ir en caso de una necesidad, por ejemplo, que se te vaya la luz. Muchas personas ya saben que ocupan la energía para cargar sus sillas eléctricas o para los de estos de gas. O también las personas que tienen insulina ocupan un refrigerador y tienen que mantener su medicamento refrigerado. Entonces, esas son las necesidades que hemos visto en la comunidad y que no tenemos a dónde ir en un caso que nos falte la energía eléctrica.
Ya mencionó una de las necesidades y los servicios, pero ¿qué más usted encontró en las encuestas o en vivir en la comunidad que le hace falta a la comunidad? ¿Qué servicios o necesidades le hacen falta aquí en la comunidad?
Pues eso, lugares a donde ir, donde la gente puede estar, por ejemplo, el calor, que hace muchísimo calor y no tienen un lugar donde tomar aire fresco y qué van a hacer, a dónde ir. Otra cosa que necesitan también es energía para cualquier cosa que necesiten. Es una de las cosas que hemos visto también y como también primeros auxilios, materiales que necesitan, que ¿qué también vamos a decir de eso? Que hemos hecho con CBE.
Sí, ¿y cómo es que usted está mirando que ahorita el cambio climático, no en el futuro, pero ahorita está afectando a usted, a su familia y a su comunidad?
Pues todos hemos visto cómo ha estado el clima, que hace calor, hace frío, ha hecho muchos aires, muchas veces hasta que en meses pasados que se cayeron los árboles. Entonces, eso estaba pasando. Muchas personas quedaron sin energía eléctrica. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que hacen esas personas? ¿A dónde recurren, verdad? Entonces, por eso también hemos estado, es importante educarnos. Y hace poco acabo de tomar un curso de SER, que es para prevenir en caso de terremoto. Y igual, no estamos preparados, créanme, no tenemos las cosas necesarias en un caso de desastre que vamos a hacer. Y es muy importante que podamos ayudarnos unos con otros también. Eso aprendimos, que es muy, muy importante que conozcamos a nuestros vecinos y que estamos unidos para apoyarnos entre nosotros.
Y en hable un poco más de eso. ¿Cómo es que nosotros nos podemos apoyar uno al otro?
Bueno, como les dije, CBE lo que ha hecho ahorita, damos bolsitas de primeros auxilios, que tengan cosas indispensables como sanitizer, como guantes, mascarillas, curitas, cosas importantes de primera necesidad, no todo, porque también no se puede, pero sí tratamos de hacer eso. Ayudamos a nuestra comunidad también para que tengan cómo empezar su cosas de emergencia, su caja de emergencias, y también distribuimos ropa, también en otras veces dimos comida, exámenes de COVID, o sea, no sé si se acuerdan que también están dando cajitas de COVID para que tuvieran el test, pudieran hacérselo ellos mismos. También dimos a conocer los centros de resiliencia, informando a la gente que podemos a lo mejor llegar a tener un centro de resiliencia para nosotros.
Y aquí ya ve 107 personas que están aquí, muchos de ellos son de la ciudad, son de diferentes agencias. ¿Qué es algo que usted les puede avisar en que nos puede apoyar ellos a nosotros?
Pues ellos nos pueden apoyar más que nada en eso, en darnos informaciones de los centros de resiliencia, darnos un lugar a donde ir, a la gente también que sepa qué hacer, qué hacer en caso de que llegue a pasar un desastre. También ofrecer espacios para educar y correr la voz, por ejemplo, dando clases o haciendo un lugar, participando en la comunidad para que ellos puedan entender lo que es y que nos puedan apoyar. Y lo más importante, a dónde ir o cómo llegar a ese lugar. Y también, obviamente, el apoyo económico de las organizaciones que estamos luchando para tener las cosas mínimo indispensables, ¿verdad? Ustedes saben que ocupamos muchos fondos también para poder ayudar a otras personas.
No dije que dijera eso, ¿ok?
No, yo lo digo. No, yo lo digo porque es lo que necesitamos.
Pero en decir eso, en la manera en que trabajamos con la ciudad, hay algunos desafíos en acceder a estos recursos, y ¿puede explicar un poco más?
Sí, pues prácticamente no tenemos a dónde ir. Nadie sabemos a dónde ir en un caso de esto. No sabemos. Luego, nadie habla de estos temas. Nadie sabe qué es esto. Nadie sabe. No hay, yo les he estado mucho tiempo en la rama de la salud y nadie nos ha platicado de los desastres, del cambio climático, de lo que nos afecta a las refinerías. Eso nadie lo hablamos. Sabemos que a lo largo al fin del día, las refinerías y todo afecta a nuestra salud. Y eso hace que gasten más medicamentos las personas porque no tienen una condición de salud buena, por lo que estamos alrededor, mínimo el sur de Los Ángeles, que somos nosotros, ¿verdad?
Y ahora, ¿cuáles son sus reflexiones y futuras visiones de lo que a usted le gustaría ver en su comunidad y en su vecindario?
Pues a mí me gustaría ir en un futuro, ver que hagan centros donde podamos dar más información, donde eduquemos a las personas, donde tengamos a dónde ir para que la gente siga entendiendo la necesidad y cómo estar preparados, ¿verdad? También que tengamos más energía renovable, que no cause daño al medio ambiente y a la salud pública, porque como les digo, al final del día es más trabajo, regulaciones para crear distancia con pozos petroleros y casas, que se hicieran los pozos, limpie bien la tierra, porque a veces no la limpian bien y entonces no quedan residuos y eso afecta también a las personas. Que no haya más desalojos, sobre todo, que las personas tengan una vivienda accesible. Ya ven cuánta gente aquí no tiene casas y andan en la calle por las razones que no tienen una vivienda accesible. También que hagan a las refinerías y todos con más regulaciones para que puedan tener mejores formas del ambiente, que no suelten tanta como gases que no se ven, pero son tóxicos para la salud.
¿Algo más que quiere mencionar? Esas son todas nuestras preguntas.
No, pues nada más eso, que sigamos informándonos y que gracias por la oportunidad de estar aquí y que veamos que en verdad necesitamos eso y las organizaciones que nos apoyen, porque yo creo que todos podemos estar y todos podemos hacer cambios si nos unimos. Dicen ustedes, es bueno unirnos para poder correr la voz y darnos a conocer, ver las necesidades que tenemos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted.
No, a ustedes por tenerme aquí, muy amables. Un placer.
Thank you, everyone. I remind you again, if you got taken out of your interpretation channel, to please select the appropriate interpretation language that you need. Buenas y gracias a todos. Les pido de nuevo que si no están en el canal de interpretación correcta, que si por favor eligen el globito de abajo y eligen el idioma que van a necesitar, por favor. Gracias. Bueno, thank you everyone for that. That was such a pleasure. I love talking with folks. I love to see some of the answers. I know we had a little bit of a shuffle in the beginning, but I think we all ended up in the appropriate breakout rooms. And we will be kind of reaching the final quarter of our workshop for today. With that, I will invite 3 facilitators to provide some of the key takeaways that came out, particularly what are the solutions, benefits, and the 2 or 3 things that folks identify that they would really like the city to support them with in regards to climate and heat resilience. And so with that, and if you're prepared, could I invite Maro, then Agustin, and then Wendy? Maro?
Sure. Thanks, Andres. So our group had a lot to share, and a commonality, I think, that came out was that a lot of old buildings and buildings in general in LA don't have air conditioning during the summer, during heat waves. It gets really hot into the triple digits sometimes in people's homes and apartments, and people need to leave their homes or apartments in order to cool off and get relief. So oftentimes it's actually hard to find a place to go to be able to cool off. Some folks shared that even if they do have AC, sometimes it's just too expensive to be able to run AC during the summers. And so that is not a feasible option for them. We had a community member from Wilmington who shared that in years past, some of the community folks would go to Costco to get a fan just so they could sleep at night because it would get really, really hot inside their homes. So some of the, and another person from our group shared about how extreme heat impacts the elderly, specifically around elderly living around Skid Row, and how they saw firsthand the public health impacts of how extreme heat can affect folks, and how a lot of senior citizens actually passed away last year during the heat waves. So it impacts the elderly and children who are most susceptible. Some of the solutions we talked about were around cooling centers or resiliency centers. So having a place for folks to just be able to go cool down during an extreme heat wave. One person in our group lived in Long Beach and shared about blue spaces. So people that are close to the water are able to go and swim in the ocean to cool off. But then what happens to those folks that are not, that, you know, don't have access to the water? So we talked about blue spaces or green spaces, so cooling centers, resiliency centers, and then another solution in terms of what the city can do and agencies is to host a town hall, because there is a lack of information about resources, about what community members should do during a heat wave. And so bringing community together to learn about what are the resources available, what the city can do to support those that are experiencing extreme heat waves, and what are the resources to actually be able to get fans, for example, to provide to community members during heat waves. So those are some of the things we talked about. And then also mentioned were just the needs around like hydration and shade stations throughout the community, and more tree shade. We need more trees. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, appreciate that. And so we heard kind of issues with accessing air conditioning, especially in older units, costs of, you know, increased utility bills, particular vulnerability for folks currently unhoused, like in Skid Row, and especially for elders who are especially susceptible to extreme heat. I love the reference too to like accessing blue spaces and shade infrastructure. I mean, we just had contamination out in Long Beach where nobody could, go out for a while. So it's also a reminder of how our blue spaces, water spaces, accessible to folks. Cool. And with that, Agustin, if I can invite you to share some of the key takeaways just very briefly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we had community members represented from MacArthur Park, Westlake, South Central, Wilmington. And so a lot of folks kind of brought up some of the things that Mauro just mentioned in terms of living in older buildings that don't have air conditioning. And so they have to really kind of spend most of their day outside of their homes. Folks talked about going to the mall or going to other, more public spaces in order to find relief. And if they do have AC, then really they're making those difficult decisions about turning on their AC or being able to afford other essential items such as food or rent. So just want to echo that, and that folks really put an emphasis that in the majority of the communities that folks live, there is a very little tree canopy. Even in the schools, in the communities, kids don't have access to shade even when they're at school or even when they're walking to school. And so really heat impacts kids and really elderly folks in our communities. And so a real emphasis on really building up trees in our communities. And then lastly, I think some of the suggestions that folks wanted to really have city agencies and public offices here is that the majority of our communities need discounted energy bills, right? And make sure that like the city doesn't cut down trees, that there's ample shade. And I think something that someone from South LA brought up that was really, really important is that not only do folks need lower energy bills, but we need higher wages, particularly for BIPOC communities, right? I think they mentioned that, people of color are often disproportionately underpaid than their white counterparts, and that the city has an obligation to make sure that there's pay equity, as well as making sure that there's more affordable and accessible housing. And that will also help contribute to the climate crisis. And then one last point I think that someone made is that we really need to think about our houseless neighbors and those workers that really work outside to make a living, day laborers, gardeners, those that work in the field or other domestic workers, and really making sure and calling on Cal OSHA or other similar city agencies to really have more stricter regulations on these for these workers that are impacted by the heat.
Thank you, Agustin. And likewise, I think, hearing that point around like having higher wages, so that people aren't facing with these like zero-sum choices or hard decisions that folks need to make about their bills, as well as the need for like things like tree canopy infrastructure, and as well as support for workers and for unhoused communities and BIPOC communities. Thank you, Agustin. And last point, Wendy, if you can speak briefly on our breakout room, actually, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, so for our breakup room, a lot of the folks there are from primarily like South LA and also from Wilmington. And a lot of the folks brought up just how there's similar to what Mauro and Agustin brought up, and also just highlighting how there's a cost burden during the heat season, whether folks stay at home or go outside. So if folks find relief outside, like for example, a mall, then they would have to spend money to be at that place to be relieved from the heat. But if they stay home, they have to turn on the AC or 2 fans sometimes because it gets so hot, and that puts a cost on their utility debt. And something else that folks brought up in relation to their utility debt is that this sometimes is in excess, like some of the low-cost programs for utilities, sometimes it's not accessible for undocumented folks. So something to highlight there. And another thing that folks brought up was that during the time of like the extreme heat season, that's also the time when kids are also out of school. So that puts a even more demand on their utilities. And as far as some solutions, a lot of folks brought up just providing more trees. And of course, like making sure that they are maintained as well, because there's a lot of or a lack of, green spaces in the area. And someone also has brought up how there's a lot of development going on in their communities. However, with the development, there's even less green spaces. There's just more concrete. So if if the city can provide a requirement for developers to have some sort of like green space in their developments, that would help alleviate some of that heat.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. And with that, just for the sake of time, I'm going to transition this over to Marta for our final portion of today's workshop. Are you, Marta?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate having been part of that breakout session. Very humbling, very enlightening, and we really want to take that to heart and back to the city. So now I have the pleasure of introducing a couple of colleagues that I feel are not only talented, creative, and innovative, but also compassionate and understand the need for equitable solutions. Ana Tabuena is a landscape architect at the City of Los Angeles and also the Assistant Director and Chief Sustainability Officer for Streets LA, or the Bureau of Street Services. And she is a registered landscape architect with experience working in both the public and private sectors. And as a landscape architect for Streets LA, Anna has successfully designed, managed, and led her team in securing approximately $300 million in active transportation, urban greening, and stormwater capture grants, which uniquely positions Streets LA to deliver upon the Green New Deal for transformative scale. Anna has led efforts in updating the city's standard plans for tree planting and representing Bureau interests in promoting holistic streetscapes, developments, and urban greening with all stakeholders. Her bachelor's degree in interior architecture from Cal State Long Beach and a master's in landscape architecture from Cal State Polytechnic University Pomona, and she has LEED AP accredited and completed business and climate change towards zero net emissions from the University of Cambridge. She's committed to achieving zero emissions, accelerated nature-based solutions, increased biodiversity, and multi-benefit projects for the City of Los Angeles. Anna also believes that maintenance and funding are twin cornerstones for sustainability. And I also have the pleasure of introducing Professor Jason Douglas, an associate professor of public health for the Department of Health Sciences at Crean College of Health and Behavioral Sciences at Chapman University. Professor Douglas, or Dr. Douglas, is an environmental health disparities researcher who leverages community-based participatory science. Douglas works with community-based organizations and residents in Black and historically marginalized communities to investigate social and environmental determinants of public health disparities. His work ranges from structured observation of neighborhood-level assets and challenges that may encourage or encumber health-promoting behaviors. His current research examines COVID-19 related health disparities, air pollution, and urban heat-related health disparities, legal drug retail, inequitable access to recreational spaces, and physical activity opportunities. He has many, many talents, and I have the pleasure of introducing them both to you to respond to some of the recommendations and experiences you've shared. Anna and Jason, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure, Marta, did you want me to go first or did you want Dr. Douglas to go first?
My apologies. Why don't you go ahead and go first, Anna?
Okay.
And then look towards Andres for the time.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. It's an honor to participate in CEMO's Climate Equity Series and hearing firsthand how extreme heat affects communities. I empathize with community members suffering from extreme heat, as I personally have heat sensitivities and used to suffer from childhood asthma, which is triggered by urban heat. And so in Streets LA, we oversee and manage the Urban Forestry Division. And that is the largest municipal street tree network in the nation. So this is a huge responsibility that includes the planting, watering, and trimming of trees and creating space for green infrastructure. Because of this huge responsibility, we work with city partners like LA Sanitation, City Plans, the City Forest Officer, and community-based organizations in fulfilling all these roles. So as many of you may know, trees play an important role during extreme heat, because in many neighborhoods, as you guys have heard during the breakout session, in LA, where parks or the beach are far or not easily accessible because you may not have a car, the street may be the only respite from heat. So trees, landscaping, and bus shelters are ways the city can provide shade and comfort that won't cost the public any money. They don't have to go to a mall, like someone mentioned, to spend money. They could just step outside of their door and experience the cooling benefits of trees and landscaping. Street trees can also provide cooling for old buildings with no existing AC, or as a way to lower utility bills if you did have AC. And it also helps ease the strain on the power grid if buildings are cooled by trees instead of AC. I'm going to pause there because I'm not sure if it needs to be translated at this point, or is translation going on at the same time? We're good. Okay, great. At Streets LA, we also have the Urban Transit Amenity Program that provides shelter, shade, safety, and comfort for the folks that are taking public transportation. So this is through our bus stop shelters and shade structures for our bus benches. This encourages folks to use public transit. The goal of the program is to ensure 75% of bus riders in each council district will be able to board buses where there is a shelter. And we prioritized based on the following factors: high transit ridership, exposure to heat, equity-focused communities like minority populations, low-income households, and zero-vehicle households, and proximity to trip generators, key destinations, and service facilities, as well as low-frequency bus routes that indicate long wait times. So the goal of our Urban Transit Amenity Program is to install and replace a total of 3,000 shelters and create alternative shade structure that can be installed in narrower sidewalks where trees may not fit by 2028. These new transit shelters will feature hydration stations and possibly other cooling features. So this will be great for folks that are, going to work or to school or to any other destinations that they have shade structure as they wait for their bus. At Streets LA, we also work on grant projects that provide community improvements in terms of urban greening, capturing stormwater, and transportation projects that encourage walking, biking, and again, taking public transportation. With all these grant-funded projects, we do extensive community engagement. I heard earlier that some folks may not be aware of resources or efforts done by the city. Within Streets LA, we are always very conscious of making sure that all our projects receive extensive community engagement and feedback so that community concerns and desires are heard and reflected in our projects. Currently, we are working on a tree inventory so we can determine how many available locations we have for tree planting. We want to try to maximize all those available locations to increase the urban tree canopy. Again, we are working with other city departments and community partners in determining prioritization of tree planting, especially centered around the most underserved areas of the city. Towards protecting our city's existing trees, we will be working on an urban forestry permit fee study so we can charge appropriate fees to developers, especially as they plan to remove trees. We are hoping that as part of this study that we can include the environmental and public health cost impacts of removing trees. We want to protect as many existing trees as possible because of the benefits that they provide. That includes cooling, but there's also mental health benefits and providing habitat and a multitude of other benefits. We currently have $500 million in active transportation, stormwater capture, and urban greening grants that will contribute to easing the impacts of urban heat, again, by encouraging more people to walk, bike, and take public transportation. We're providing trees and landscaping to cool the air for folks that are walking, biking, and taking public transportation. So that's all I have so far, and I'll pass it on to my partner here, Dr.
Jason Douglas.
Dr.
Take it
Jason
away.
Douglas, sorry.
Hi, everybody. Let me just start by saying thank you so much for sharing this space. I'm really enjoying listening and contributing to conversations, learning more about folks' experience of place. So this has been fantastic. And thank you very much for the kind introduction, Marta and Anna. Tough act to follow. You're doing such amazing work. Thank you for sharing. So let me just start off with this. As an environmental, community-engaged environmental health disparities researcher, my mission is to really work with communities to identify empowerment pathways, to advance, really put residents in a position to advance health and well-being in our communities. And, as part of this, I believe knowledge is power. So what I'd like to talk about is a little bit of, what we're doing in communities now to address urban heat. For example, in partnership with Communities for a Better Environment, a fantastic organization that you all are familiar with. I'm actually, president of the board of directors for the organization, but I also work closely with CBE on research initiatives. And one of them is a NASA funded research project for which I'm principal investigator, wherein we are examining the unequal distribution of air pollutants, urban heat, but also the good stuff, green space within our communities. Because, I'm preaching to the choir. We know very well that, our BIPOC communities, our underserved communities bear an uneven burden of air pollutants, an uneven burden of urban heat. That's why we're here. But we also know that we don't have the good stuff, right? We know that the distribution of green spaces, which could help to alleviate some of the stress of heat exposure, is unevenly distributed in our communities. So, in this project, what we're trying to do is identify where we need resources to address health disparities associated with heat exposure. I want to come back to what Maria Montes said earlier, right? And Maria, I'm quoting you now, so if I'm misquoting, please forgive me. I believe you said, we need resources. So to do this, right, what we are currently doing is we're bringing different kinds of resources to our communities. We are training residents, for example, in Southeast Los Angeles to use NASA remote sensing technology, right, to examine where the highest heat exposures are in our communities. And that's fantastic, bringing that kind of tech and knowledge to and sharing it with residents so that residents are empowered to say, I can tell you exactly where the highest exposures are. But then we're also, for example, we're teaching folks how to use EcoStress, right, which is a thermal instrument that's on the International Space Station. This is cool stuff. But then by residents learning how to use this technology, right, they can also match it with their experience of place. NASA remote sensing technology is great. It can tell us where the highest exposures are. But only residents and affected communities can tell us where we are being impacted, right? where people are experiencing deleterious heat exposure. So to do this, we're also using ground truthing techniques like participatory mapping, where we bring together residents to say, hey, here are our heat maps. This is where we're seeing, high surface temperatures across Southeast Los Angeles, across South Los Angeles. But where are you actually experiencing health impacts as a result of these exposures? So ultimately, what we're doing by, mapping, folks' experience of place within these communities, we're merging it with NASA technology, right? Merging resident knowledge and resident experience of place with NASA technology so that we can then turn around and accomplish several things together. For example, we're now telling NASA how to better calibrate their tools to support environmental justice communities is an important aspect of this. But we're also now better able to identify where affected communities that are burdened by high densities of roadways and traffic, industrial and polluting facilities, where exactly we will benefit from increases in green space. From an equitable standpoint, where do we need to direct, as Maria said, life-saving resources in our communities? So in this, I advocate that only communities in affected community residents rather in affected communities can direct where we need these resources. And I advocate that we need to identify empowerment pathways, such as the one that I'm presenting to you, so that residents can say, not only is this our experience, but we can also quantify and prove it to you, so that when you tell us you need data, guess what? We have it, and we can show you where the greatest impacts are. And now we can use that data to advocate for policies and practices that reduce urban heat exposure and improve health and well-being in our communities. And we're seeing great effects. We're already seeing residents that are initiating small-scale initiatives. For example, we have students that are launching projects at their schools. They're painting dark surfaces, lighter colors to reduce heat exposure, introducing native flora, which is really inspiring. So thank you for letting me share just a little bit about my work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna and Dr. Jason Douglas. I think at this point, and this is going to have to rescue me if I'm not correct, we are ready for our outro. I really want to thank all the participants, the facilitators, the note takers, those of you who sacrificed your evening to provide the City of Los Angeles with really relevant wisdom and experience from your communities and your voices. Rest assured that this information will be placed into a report and provided to the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission. The city leaders and city council will get this information. But I did want to say that extreme heat is the challenge for Los Angeles and our primary climate hazard. And as such, it's a really wicked and really tricky issue. And we have to learn from the mistakes of our past, the mistakes from other cities, and ensure that in not repeating those mistakes, we create no harm. And again, this is why community voices in this dialogue are priceless. They are brutally honest, and we need brutal honesty. We also will be exploring more pilot programs and multi-phase approaches, as well as financing models that can facilitate building decarbonization, more heat resilience zones and tools, and pop-up heat relief stations for the homeless. By centering the needs and priorities of the underserved and over-impacted communities in our approach to extreme heat, we can work towards long-term and short-term solutions that create more resilient and equitable Los Angeles. Working together and using science, spatial mapping, public health data, metrics, community wisdom at the top. We can succeed for all Angelinos and have access to the resources that we all need to stay safe and healthy during extreme heat. And I want to make sure to remind you that on May 24th, we will launch our Heat Relief for LA public awareness campaign, and we hope that you will join us. We will have a call to action and provide details of this campaign so that you too can stay engaged and be engaged. It is time for all major cities to understand that if we prioritize climate, health, infrastructure, green, healthy housing investments, our frontline communities, all boats will rise and we will experience climate solutions for all and an economic recovery that will improve everyone's lives. Centering equity and climate is necessary if we wish to live in a habitable, non-scorched, drought-ridden city for future generations. And for our collective survival, it is imperative. So thank you so much again for your amazing participation, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thank you once again. Good night, everyone.